Berlin, April 23rd, 1945. Sirens fractured the morning into jagged pieces. Windows rattled in their frames. The air smelled of brick dust and wet ash, and a crow hopped along a broken gutter as if the city were just a new kind of branch. Jonas Keller stood in the stairwell with his school satchel in one hand and his father's dented helmet in the other. 16, too tall for his last pair of trousers, not tall enough for what the radio was asking. All males over 15, the voice crackled, cheerful as a lie. Report to the district hall. Volkssturm mobilization. Berlin stands. Berlin leaned. His mother pressed a buttoned wool coat into his arms that still held winter. She did not cry. She tied the strap under his chin with fingers that shook only after she let go. A loaf of last night bread went into the satchel beside a math notebook, a pencil worn to a sliver, and the small tin of his father's shaving soap that still smelled like Sundays. "Come back by evening," she said, as if evenings were still a thing that happened on time. He nodded, like a promise he didn't understand. The stairwell filled with footsteps, men who had once been neighbors becoming recruits between floors. On the third landing, a boy Jonas knew from school, Matthias, fumbled with a sleeve too long for his arm and grinned, because that's what boys do when the ground moves, pretend it's a game. Behind him, Fritz, 17, shoulders already learning a man's weight, lifted 2 fingers in a salute that aimed for brave and landed on tired. Outside, the street was more crater than cobble. Posters peeled from walls in long tongues. The church clock insisted it was 9 to 12, though time had declared bankruptcy days ago. Somewhere, a tram bell rang once and remembered there were no trams. They walked, not in formation, in a line human enough to bend around rubble. At the district hall, once a gymnasium that smelled of varnish and rope burn, banners hung like exhausted lungs. A table had been dragged to the center of the floor. Behind it, a man with a clipboard and a trimmer read names that tried to sound like orders. "Age?" he asked each boy. 17, said Jonas. "Really?" "Yes." The man didn't look up. He stamped a card, ink bleeding at the edges, and pushed a cloth armband across the table. Black letters on white, Volkssturm. It looked less like a uniform and more like a label. They were handed rifles older than their fathers and a single cartridge each, wrapped in waxed paper, like candy. "More at the front," someone promised, a sentence that had never arrived on time. "Swear," said the trembling man, and they repeated words that had been written when there were still parades. Their voices echoed off climbing bars and the faded outline of a basketball key. Jonas felt the oath pass through him without finding a hook. Fritz leaned close and whispered, "After this, we'll go by the bakery on Savigny-Platz. They still have something if you knock twice." Jonas nodded, and for a moment the city was small enough for bread again. They practiced loading with nothing to load. The motions were clean. Lift, click, aim, breathe, like a ritual that had forgotten its god. An older veteran with a coat full of mismatched buttons showed them how to strip the bolt and not strip the skin from their fingers. "Keep your hands," he said. "You'll need them to wave when this is over." "Over?" Matthias mouthed, as if trying on a foreign word. An officer with a red face and winter ears unrolled a map on the polished floor. It was a school map, the kind with countries and colors that looked like candy, now marked with pencil arrows that pointed in from every direction. "You boys," he said, tapping the bridge at Charlottenburg with a chewed pencil, "hold this. Tanks will come." Don't run. Berlin is watching. Berlin was hiding in basements. They were issued spades that had once been for gardens and now were for defense, and 2 bottles each with cloth stuffed in the necks. Petrol later, someone said. Later was a place past the next siren. Jonas shouldered the rifle. It knocked against the tin of shaving soap with a small hollow sound. He thought of his father's face in the mirror, foam like first snow, a hand steady enough to trust with a blade. His father had not come home from somewhere too far to imagine. The helmet pinched against Jonas's ear where the dent folded in. They stepped back into the afternoon that already looked like evening. Smoke drew lines across the sky like bad handwriting. A piano somewhere tried 3 notes and gave up on the 4th. On the walk west, Fritz kicked a stone and missed and laughed like missing was still allowed. Matthias counted steps under his breath until the numbers turned into prayer. Jonas took out his notebook, and while they waited at a corner where a house had collapsed into a polite heap, wrote, "We were told we are the future." The future looks like a boy in his school coat, holding a rifle that doesn't fit. They crossed a canal that smelled of spring, pretending to be water. On the far side, a woman in a doorway handed them a wedge of potato and a look that said, "Both be careful and forgive me." Jonas thanked her and didn't know which she meant. At the bridge, there was already a wall built from desks, doors, and the idea that something could still be stopped. Chalk dust rose from the wooden barricade in little ghosts. He could almost read geometry on the desktops. Angles, proofs, therefore. Therefore what? Fritz asked. Therefore nothing, Jonas said, and placed his single cartridge in his coat pocket like a coin for a machine that might not exist. They were just boys, lined along a river that no longer bothered to reflect the city. Somewhere beyond the far bank, a sound rolled over the rooftops like weather, tanks or thunder, or the end of one thing pretending to be the start of another. "Look brave," someone said. "They might be watching." Jonas looked at the water instead and saw only ripples working hard to become a pattern. Evening came. They took turns trying on courage until it fit none of them. When darkness finally made everything the same color, the officer sent them to the ruins of an apartment block for shelter. They climbed the staircase that wasn't there and found a room with 3 walls and a sky. In the corner, a wardrobe stood open and empty, smelling faintly of soap and the person who once chose shirts in that exact light. Fritz tore the loaf of bread into equal lies. Matthias said grace without the name. They talked about football as if a ball might roll in any minute and fix the world. They talked about girls and spring and the time Jonas rode a tram without paying and felt like a king for 2 stops. They did not talk about tanks. When the wind shifted, it carried a distant song that had forgotten its words. Jonas took out the notebook again and, by the moon's patient face, wrote, "They told us to be ready to die for Berlin. No one told Berlin to live for us." He closed the book and put it over his heart, because that's where you put thin things you hope will stop heavy ones. "Tomorrow?" Matthias asked. "Tomorrow," Jonas said, and didn't add anything because they were just boys, and tomorrow was a cliff. Sleep came in pieces. The city breathed. Somewhere a bell struck 9, then 10, then, out of habit, 11. And then, from far off, a new sound. Tracks on road, metal finding its sentence. Jonas did not pray. He pressed his palm to the floor and felt the building remember the world below it. If you think bravery is loud, wait until you hear how quiet a 16-year-old can be when the future arrives made of steel. Berlin, April 24, 1945. Morning didn't arrive. It simply replaced the dark. Gray seeped through cracks in the sky, thick with smoke and the low growl of engines somewhere to the east. Jonas woke to the sound of boots scuffing stone, a cough, the clink of metal against metal. They had slept in what had once been a child's bedroom. 3 boys in a line on the floor beneath a faded wallpaper of clouds and tiny painted planes. Someone had drawn smiling faces on them once, long before the real ones began to fall from the sky. Fritz was already awake, feeding splinters of chair leg into a small fire in a tin bucket. The smoke crawled upward, searching for an exit. Matthias sat by the window frame, knees to his chest, staring at nothing. He looked 12 in that light. Outside, an officer's voice barked across the rubble. "Form up!" Jonas glanced at Fritz, who muttered, "There's no line left to form." Still, they obeyed, boys conditioned to turn orders into motion. They gathered on the street below, 20 of them in all, some with helmets, some bareheaded, all carrying rifles that belonged to another war. The officer, a man whose left arm hung limp at his side, paced before them, shouting words that no longer reached meaning. "Berlin expects you to stand. The Führer believes in you. The Reich depends on your courage." His voice cracked on courage. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. None of them had. Jonas felt the words wash over him like cold rain. Berlin didn't expect anything. Berlin was broken, bleeding, hiding, and the Führer, whoever he was to them now, had become more rumor than man. The officer stopped, produced a tattered flag, and held it high. "Repeat after me," he said, and they did. "I swear to give my life for Germany, for our Führer, and for the victory that awaits us." Jonas mumbled the words. Fritz said nothing, just moved his lips to match the rhythm. Matthias's voice cracked halfway through and disappeared. The officer didn't notice or didn't care. When the chant ended, he muttered, "Good enough," and handed Jonas a medal, tin, dull, edges bent. "For morale," he said, though his tone made it sound like a question. Jonas slipped it into his pocket, feeling its cheap weight. He thought of the badge his father once wore from the Great War, real silver, polished every Sunday, back when medals still meant survival. They spent the morning digging, not graves, not yet, positions. The officer pointed at a street corner overlooking the canal. "Here," he said, "hold until relief arrives." No one asked when that would be. Relief had become as mythical as victory. They built a barricade of desks, sandbags, and parts of a tramcar that had derailed months before. The air smelled of rust and cold oil. Jonas's hands blistered against the shovel handle, the skin splitting in thin red lines that stung when he touched the wood. Fritz hummed as he worked, a tune from a radio show they used to listen to during summer homework. It sounded almost cheerful until it broke into silence halfway through. At midday, the officer gathered them again. He unrolled a crumpled map across the hood of a wrecked car. Red arrows converged from every side. "Russian armor is here," he said, pointing. "We'll make them pay for every meter." Jonas stared at the paper. The arrows weren't lines, they were hands closing in. By afternoon, the sound of artillery grew constant, distant at first, then steady, like a heartbeat the city couldn't control. Windows trembled. Dust fell in thin veils. A group of younger boys arrived, barely 15, led by a priest with a wooden cross dangling from his neck and exhaustion in his eyes. "Volunteers," he said quietly. Jonas looked at them and felt his stomach twist. One of them was still wearing his school blazer, buttons shining beneath the dirt. They were not soldiers. They were echoes. He wrote later that night in his notebook, "We said the oath today." It felt like borrowing someone else's prayer. The man who made us say it looked like he needed saving more than we did. At dusk, the officer came by with a single jug of water. He poured it into tin cups, one sip each. The taste was metallic, like rain caught in a bucket. Then he sat down beside them, hands shaking, and whispered, "If you survive, don't remember this. Just don't." For a moment, he wasn't an officer. He was just another man afraid of morning. Fritz leaned close and whispered, "My mother used to say God doesn't watch wars. Maybe he just closes his eyes." Jonas replied, "Then maybe he'll sleep through ours." They laughed, but quietly, like people who didn't want to wake the dead. Night fell heavy. The city burned somewhere far off, fires crawling through rooftops like veins of light. Jonas couldn't tell if the sound he heard was thunder or tanks. He lay on his back, staring at the sky through a gap in the wall. Stars, faint and fragile, shivered behind the smoke. He took out his notebook again and wrote one more line before closing it against his chest. "If this is bravery, it's quieter than I expected." They had taken an oath to die for a city that had already fallen. They were not soldiers. They were sons pretending not to be afraid of the dark. Berlin, April 25th, 1945. It began before dawn. A sound that didn't belong to the earth. A low rumble, heavy and distant, rolling through the streets like a storm made of iron. The boys froze, listening. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Jonas crouched behind the barricade, fingers wrapped around the rifle that refused to feel familiar. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of the tanks drawing closer. Slow, unstoppable. He looked to his right. Fritz sat beside him, jaw tight, face pale. To his left, Matthias whispered a prayer so softly it barely reached his own ears. The officer shouted from across the street, "Hold your fire till they're close." Close. The word hit like ice. Through the morning fog, shadows began to move, huge, deliberate, groaning under the weight of war. T-34s. The red stars painted on their hulls looked alive under the smoke. Jonas swallowed hard. His rifle trembled. He couldn't tell if it was from fear or the cold. Maybe both. He had imagined war once, the way the newspapers described it. Neat lines, proud faces, flags waving like salvation. But here, now, in this broken street littered with children in oversized helmets, it felt nothing like glory. It felt like waiting to be forgotten. The first shell hit a building 2 blocks away. The explosion rolled through them, a flash of orange swallowed by gray. Plaster rained from the walls, and the sky filled with screaming stone. "Fire!" the officer yelled, but no one moved. Jonas raised his rifle and aimed at the moving shadows. He squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked once and spat smoke. His single bullet lost somewhere in the chaos. The recoil stung his shoulder. His ears rang with the sound of his own heartbeat. Fritz fired too, missing everything but silence. Matthias's rifle jammed, and he just froze, staring at it like it had betrayed him. Another shell hit, Closer this time. The barricade shuddered. Flames licked at the broken desks they'd stacked into defense. Jonas saw the officer standing in the open, shouting something, waving his pistol toward the tanks. And then the man disappeared in a cloud of dust. For a moment, all sound vanished, just the ringing in Jonas's head and the crackle of fire. He looked around. The boys scattered, some running, some crawling, none of them heroes. He saw Matthias dragging himself toward cover, clutching his leg, blood soaking into the dirt. Jonas moved without thinking, pulling him behind a doorway that wasn't there anymore. Fritz joined them, panting, eyes wide. The three of them sat there, pressed together, breathing the same dust. "We can't win this," Fritz whispered. Jonas didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth didn't need words. When the tanks finally passed, the street was gone. Fire chewed through the ruins, windows glowing like open wounds. The officer's body lay twisted near the barricade, the flag he had carried now half buried in rubble. Jonas crawled out, gun still in hand, though it no longer felt like a weapon. It felt like an apology. He found Matthias trying to tie a strip of cloth around his leg. Fritz stood over them, scanning the street with a haunted look. "Do we run?" he asked. Jonas shook his head. "Where to?" No one answered. There was nowhere left to go. They hid in the basement of a bombed-out bakery. The shelves above them still held blackened loaves, hard as stone, dusted with soot instead of flour. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and something sweet that had died long ago. Fritz found an old tin of jam and opened it carefully using the edge of his bayonet. The inside was crystallized, glittering like red glass. They each took a small piece with their fingers, tasting sugar for the first time in weeks. It almost made them smile. Matthias leaned his head against the wall and murmured, "Do you think anyone will remember us?" Fritz laughed quietly, not because it was funny, but because it wasn't. "They'll remember the generals, not us." Jonas looked down at his notebook. His hands were shaking as he wrote, "The newspapers will say the city was defended by heroes. They won't say we were children. They won't say we were afraid." Night came again. The firelight outside painted the ceiling red. They could hear footsteps, Soviet voices echoing through the ruins. Jonas clutched his rifle, but Fritz pushed it down. "No," he said, "enough." They sat in silence, listening to the city breathe its last. Somewhere, a piano played a few broken notes. Someone testing whether beauty still worked? It didn't. Jonas looked at his friends, faces lit by the flicker of flame, and thought of school, of chalk dust, of the sound of laughter in hallways. It felt like another lifetime, maybe someone else's. He closed his notebook and whispered, "If I die here, I want them to know we tried." Fritz nodded, eyes wet. Matthias smiled faintly. "You always write like someone's going to read it." Jonas looked at him and said, "Maybe that's the only reason to write." Outside, a tank engine roared again. Closer this time. The wall shook. Dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow. Fritz stood, gripping his empty rifle, and shouted something, maybe courage, maybe defiance, before the sound swallowed him. Jonas ducked, covering Matthias with his body as the world came apart once more. Then, silence. When the smoke cleared, Fritz was gone. The doorway was gone. Only the three rifles remained, leaning against the wall like tired men. Jonas closed his eyes. The notebook lay open on his knee. He touched the page with trembling fingers and wrote one last line before the light failed. The street is gone, the city is gone, but we are still here for now. They had been told they were Germany's last defense, but no one defended them from the truth. If you think war makes men, wait until you see what it does to boys. Berlin, April 26, 1945. Night didn't fall. It simply gave up. The fires had burned too long for darkness to be pure anymore. The sky above the city flickered red and gray, the color of endings. Jonas sat in what had once been a kitchen. The ceiling was open to the air, and through the cracks he could see the faint shimmer of snowflakes, or maybe ash, drifting down like quiet ghosts. Beside him, Matthias slept fitfully, his wounded leg propped against a broken chair. Fritz's rifle lay on the floor near the wall where it had fallen hours ago. Jonas couldn't bring himself to move it. He just looked at it sometimes, the same way one might glance at a door they know won't open. He took out his notebook and wrote slowly, the pencil dull and shaking between his fingers. It's strange. The world is ending, but I can still hear the ticking of a watch someone left behind. Maybe time doesn't know what's happening here. The basement door creaked open. A young man stepped in. Not a soldier, not really, just another boy in a uniform that no longer meant anything. He carried a loaf of bread, hard and blackened at the edges. "I found this," he said softly. Jonas recognized him. Wilhelm, from another street patrol, maybe 17. He sat down beside them, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that has already seen too much. They broke the bread with their hands. It tasted of smoke and salt and home. No one spoke for a while. The silence was a mercy. Later, when Matthias woke, he asked in a small voice, "Do you think the war ends tomorrow?" Wilhelm laughed quietly, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "The war ends every night, and every morning it wakes up again." Jonas stared at the flames licking the wall. "Maybe it'll forget this time," he said. Matthias smiled weakly. "You always talk like a teacher." "My father was one." "What did he teach?" Jonas hesitated. "How to see the world before it disappeared." Outside, the gunfire had faded, replaced by the sound of the wind moving through empty streets. It whistled between the buildings, carrying scraps of paper and whispers of words that had lost their meaning. Jonas picked up a torn poster from the floor, the face of a leader printed in bold lines. The slogan underneath, half burned. He read what was left. "Victory," and then nothing. He crumpled it and tossed it into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and disappeared. "Maybe that's the only honest word left," he said quietly. Matthias didn't ask which one. They spoke about everything except tomorrow, about their families, about the river where they used to swim in summer, about a girl named Anneliese who had smiled at Jonas once at school and never again after the first air raid. Wilhelm told them he had hidden in the zoo once during a bombing, in the lion cage, long after the lions were gone. He said the cages had been empty, the sign still there. "Do not feed." Matthias laughed softly, a dry sound. No one needed that sign anymore. Jonas wrote another line. "We are sitting in a dead city, waiting for morning to decide if it wants us." He stared at the page for a long time before closing the book. The pencil snapped in half between his fingers. He didn't even feel it. Wilhelm looked at him and said, "When this is over, what will you do?" Jonas shrugged. If it ends, I'll try to remember everything they told me to forget. They fell silent again. The fire had burned down to embers. Matthias leaned against the wall and whispered something that sounded like prayer. Wilhelm sat with his back to the door, rifle across his lap, eyes on the flickering light. Jonas didn't sleep. He couldn't. He watched the shadows dance across the ceiling and thought how small they all looked. Boys pretending to be the shape of men. He took out the medal they'd given him days earlier. It caught the light weakly, like tin pretending to be silver. He ran his thumb across the engraving, then tossed it into the corner. The sound it made was barely louder than a heartbeat. Near dawn, when the sky began to pale, Jonas heard something. Not tanks this time, but voices. Soviet? Close. He nudged Matthias gently. The boy opened his eyes, nodded once, said nothing. Wilhelm stood, checked his rifle, empty, and looked at them both. No more running, he said. Jonas wanted to say something, a protest, a prayer, anything, but words felt too heavy to lift. He simply nodded. As the first light spilled into the ruined kitchen, the three boys stood together. Outside, footsteps echoed, cautious, deliberate. Jonas raised his hands. Wilhelm hesitated. Matthias closed his eyes, and then the doorway filled with light, not divine, just morning. The shape of a soldier appeared in it, uniform foreign, rifle lowered. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the soldier spoke, voice rough but not cruel. "Go home, boys," he said in broken German. "War finished." They didn't move, not because they didn't believe him, but because they no longer knew where home was. Jonas stared at the man, then at the empty city behind him. He wanted to cry or laugh or scream. Instead, he whispered, "We were just boys." The soldier looked at them for a long time, eyes tired, then nodded slowly, as if to say, "I know." The war was over, but the silence it left behind was the kind that never ends. They fought for a city that no longer existed and survived just long enough to wonder why. If you think victory means living, wait until you've seen what the living have to carry. Berlin, April 26, 1945, morning. For a few fragile minutes, time forgot to move. The Soviet soldiers' words still hung in the air. "Go home, boys." They didn't sound like mercy or threat, just truth. Jonas almost believed him. But then another tank turned the corner, grinding over the cobblestones, its cannons swinging like a blind eye searching for sound. The soldier stepped aside, shouting something in Russian, waving his arms. The tank hesitated, then thundered forward again, deaf to reason. "Down!" Wilhelm shouted, pushing Matthias to the floor. Jonas dove behind the wall as the shell hit the building across the street. Glass, dust, and daylight exploded all at once. When the noise ended, nothing was left to hold the air together. He heard crying, a boy's voice, small and sharp. Matthias. Jonas crawled across the rubble, hands bleeding, pulling at bricks until he found him. Matthias's leg, the one already wounded, was pinned under a beam. Blood soaked through his trousers, dark and spreading. He looked up, eyes glassy but awake. "It's not bad," Matthias whispered. It was. Jonas gripped his hand, tried to lift the beam, failed. Wilhelm appeared beside them, face streaked with soot, coughing hard. He dropped to his knees and shouted over the roar of another explosion. "We can't stay here." Jonas looked at him desperate. "Help me." They tried together, but the beam didn't move. Matthias squeezed Jonas's hand, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. "Go," he said. "Please." Jonas shook his head. "No." "Jonas," Matthias said softly, "we were just supposed to guard a bridge." He laughed once, a sound that broke apart halfway through, and then another shell landed nearby. Jonas flinched, felt the heat pass over him like breath. When the dust cleared, Matthias wasn't speaking anymore. Wilhelm grabbed him by the collar, dragging him back toward the canal. "Move! They'll kill us both!" Jonas stumbled, feet slipping on debris. Behind them, the apartment collapsed into itself, a slow final sigh. They ran through the ruins, turning corners that led to nowhere. Every street looked the same, a skeleton of stone and smoke. The city that had raised them was now unrecognizable, a graveyard wearing its own clothes. When they reached the bridge, the officer's flag still fluttered, half-burned. No more Volkssturm, no more army, just wind. Jonas stopped. He dropped his rifle. It clattered against the pavement and lay still. Wilhelm turned. "What are you doing?" Jonas looked down at the river below, gray, cold, indifferent. "I don't know," he said. "I just can't keep pretending." For a moment, they stood there, two boys in a city that had forgotten them, and then footsteps echoed again. Russian voices, closer this time. Wilhelm panicked. He lifted his rifle, even though it was empty. "Don't," Jonas whispered, but it was too late. A burst of gunfire tore through the air. When Jonas opened his eyes, Wilhelm was on the ground, his hands still gripping the weapon. He looked surprised, as if death had interrupted him mid-thought. The sound of boots followed, and suddenly Jonas was surrounded. 3 Soviet soldiers, faces blank, guns raised. Jonas raised his hand slowly, palms open, eyes fixed on the ground. His lips trembled. "I'm not," he began, but the words died. The soldiers looked at each other. One of them, older, weary, stepped forward. He saw the armband, the 2 big boots, the boy's trembling shoulders. Then he lowered his rifle. In broken German, he said quietly, "You're just a child." Jonas didn't nod, didn't move. He felt the truth of it, like a wound reopening. The soldier sighed, motioned for the others to move on. He turned back once more, muttered something Jonas didn't catch, and disappeared into the smoke. Jonas stood alone on the bridge. The wind picked up, carrying the faint smell of gunpowder and spring. He stared at the water, at the reflections of burning buildings trembling across the surface. Somewhere behind him, someone shouted orders. Somewhere else, someone stopped shouting forever. He reached into his pocket and took out his notebook. It was blackened at the corners, pages smudged with ash and blood. He flipped it open to the last page. His hand shook as he wrote. "We fought for a city that was already dead. We died for men who never saw our faces. We were not heroes. We were just boys." He tore the page out, folded it, and dropped it into the river. The paper floated for a moment, then sank, disappearing beneath the ripples. Jonas watched until the last hint of white was gone. Then he turned and walked away, not toward home, because there was no home, but toward whatever was left. The sound of tanks faded behind him. The wind filled the silence, and Berlin, or what remained of it, finally exhaled. He had survived the war, but not the part of it that lived inside him. If you think youth is protection, wait until you see how easily it burns. Berlin, 1985. The city was clean again. The streets were paved smooth, the air hummed with trams, and the shop windows glowed with colors that hadn't existed in 1945. Even the river had learned to forget, its water clear now, flowing quietly beneath bridges that no longer remembered how to burn. But Jonas Keller, 60 years old, still carried the smell of smoke somewhere inside him. He walked with a slow, deliberate rhythm, a cane in one hand and an old notebook in the other, the same one he had carried as a boy. The edges were frayed, the ink faded, but it was still there, still breathing. He stopped halfway across the Charlottenburg Bridge, the same bridge, the one they'd been ordered to defend, the one where everything had ended. Tourists walked by, laughing, snapping photographs, their voices light against the hum of the city. They didn't see him. They never did. Jonas looked down at the water. It was calm, patient, pretending not to remember the bodies it had once carried. He rested his hand on the railing and whispered, "It's all right. I remember for you." He opened the notebook. Most of the pages were blank now, torn, washed out, smudged by rain and time. But the last page remained, the words etched deep as scars. We were not heroes. We were just boys. He traced the lines with his fingertips, the way one touches a name on a gravestone. A voice behind him interrupted the silence. "Grandpa?" Jonas turned. A boy, maybe 16, maybe younger, stood there holding a camera, hair windswept, eyes curious. "Is this where you fought?" the boy asked. Jonas hesitated. He looked at the bridge, the water, the sky that had once been on fire. Then he nodded. "Yes, this is where we tried to be men." The boy frowned. "Did you win?" Jonas smiled faintly, a tired, knowing smile. "No," he said, "but we learned what losing really means." The boy looked confused, but didn't ask more. He pointed the camera toward the river. "Can I take your picture?" Jonas chuckled softly. "If you must." The shutter clicked, a small, bright sound like a door opening. For a second, Jonas saw the reflection of the boy in the lens, the same age he had been that day 40 years ago. And in that moment, the two faces blurred, past and present, ghost and blood. They sat on the edge of the bridge together. The boy swung his legs idly. Jonas kept his eyes on the river. "Grandpa," the boy said after a while, "do you still hate them?" Jonas shook his head. "No, hate's heavy. I left it somewhere back there." He gestured toward the horizon. "It's lighter, to carry memory." The boy looked at the notebook. "Is that your diary?" Jonas nodded. The boy reached out. "Can I read it?" "Someday," Jonas said, "when you're old enough to understand what silence costs." The boy looked disappointed, but accepted it. He turned back to the water. Jonas smiled at him, at the way youth could still exist in this place. Then, quietly, he opened the notebook one last time and slipped a folded paper between its pages. A photograph. 3 boys in uniform, half smiling, standing beside a pile of rubble that used to be a street. Fritz, Matthias, and himself. The photo had faded, but their faces were still there, captured mid-breath, mid-dream, mid-life. He whispered their names under his breath, letting each one dissolve into the wind. As the sun dipped low, the city lights blinked on. Cars hummed. Laughter drifted from a cafe nearby. Life had returned to Berlin. Indifferent, beautiful, unstoppable. Jonas stood slowly, closing the notebook. He looked down at the river one last time and said, almost to himself, "You can rebuild a city, but not a boy." He placed the notebook gently on the railing, ran his fingers across its cover, then tucked it back under his coat. "Come on," he told his grandson. "Let's go home." As they walked away, the wind caught the faint smell of rain, or maybe smoke, and carried it downstream. Behind them, the bridge stood silent, steady, as if keeping its promise to remember. They were told they were Germany's last defense, but history would learn they were its first victims. They didn't die for glory. They died for a lie. And somehow, that lie still whispered through generations. He lived long enough to see peace, but never long enough to stop hearing the war. He once wrote, "We were just boys." And maybe that's the truest thing ever said about war, that every uniform, every flag, every promise of honor begins and ends with children pretending to be men.